Neu was a German krautrock band formed in the early 1970s, and they are one of the classic krautrock greats. The band is fronted by Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger, who are also known to be former members of Kraftwerk. And they released one of my favorite albums, Neu 75, which came out in 1975. So for those that are not familiar with krautrock, it was this incredible musical movement that started in the late 1960s, that was catalyzed by the rise of psychedelic rock as well as technological advancements in things like synthesizers. And essentially it gave these new up-and-coming German musicians a fresh palette of sounds that they could use to explore and define themselves with. Because these emerging new German musicians were born straight out of a post-World War II era, inevitably they had a sense of starting anew, kind of rebuilding and reinventing a culture for themselves, and it's this sense of continuing to move forward that gave these German musicians inspiration to experiment and innovate. Because there was such a variety of events and developments happening at this time, the way it has influenced krautrock has made the genre itself quite varied. You have bands like Can, Neu, and Faust that were way more grounded in using rock instrumentation as well as electronic sounds, but compared to other krautrock bands like Tangerine Dream, Popol Vuh, and later on Kraftwerk, they were leaning way more towards an electronic side of things. So that's just a brief introduction to krautrock. I highly suggest checking out Noisy's documentary on krautrock if you feel like you're interested. And now let's get into why this special album is one of my favorites, Neu 75. And really, to explain why this album is so great to me, I can really just talk about why the band Neu in general is so special, because from their debut album up to this album, Neu 75, they do have quite a consistent style and sound. And essentially when listening to Neu, you'll start to really quickly pick up that the most prominent element in their music, at least to me, is the drumming. Many of their songs are so simple and minimalistic, yet they're surprisingly incredibly infectious and hypnotic to listen to. And that goes for a lot of krautrock, especially for one of my other favorite bands called Can. The iconic style of drumming that is heard on this album and on many other krautrock albums is something called the motoric beat. And it's another term that's coined by music journalists at the time, and it sounds something like this. Yes, this incredibly simplistic 4/4 beat is utilized on this album, and it showcases just how effective simplicity can be for music. I can't stress this enough. This is, to me, one of the significant reasons why Neu 75 is so fantastic. It's embracing simple, minimalistic musical ideas that range from ambient to punk music, and it just makes me keep going and just moving forward. The rhythms, they're just so driving in that sense. With that being said, the minimalistic style of Neu, with their repetitive rhythms and whatnot, is very reflective of the krautrock style. Even though different krautrock groups were more or less doing their own thing with their sound, a more minimalistic element did thread through pretty much every krautrock group, from Can to Kraftwerk. They love to just implement these repetitive grooves, rhythms, and beats. These are ideas that we do take for granted today, but back then I don't think there were really any bands, or at least a group of bands, that were really embracing this kind of thing, at least in the same way these krautrock artists have.
This fast forward reaching music, which was our idea at the time. A music that sort of runs forward and has no ending, is directed, aimed at the horizon or beyond.
Sometimes less really is more. I really do think that simple musical ideas that are repeated over and over is just an effective way to create momentum and drive in a song. You hear it straight from the first track, Issy, which starts off with these simple, light piano chords before that iconic motoric drum beat comes in. And then you have this shimmering synthesizer that follows, and it's just so light and beautiful on the ears. All of these elements really come together, and it's just a perfect track to put on and just cruise down a highway on a bright, lush, sunny day. Because of its repetitiveness, the track feels both very easy to pick up on and listen to, while at the same time it just has a very ambient quality to it without actually it having to be ambient. And again, this is very reflective on a lot of krautrock, and it's the main reason why I absolutely love bands like Neu and Can. Moving on to the second track, Sealand, this is another gorgeous track. Even more atmospheric sounding than the first, there isn't so much a rhythmically moving drum beat, but what makes this particular track stand out is its gorgeous melodic passage and the lead sound that is used. The slow moving tempo, along with the reverb soaked guitar lead and the woodblock percussion, is just so reminiscent of what a shoegaze / dream pop band would do. But this is like 15 years before something like shoegaze would even become a thing, which is just crazy. I mean, the krautrock scene had just created so many new musical ideas that it would just go on to become incredibly ahead of its time. So if you're a fan of shoegaze / dream pop type stuff, then definitely check out this track Sealand. It is just gorgeous. Now, I don't want to talk about every single track on this album. I find that to be a little long-winded, so I'm going to move on to my next major point as to what makes this album so fantastic. Noise 75 isn't just a great krautrock album, it's a proto-punk album as well. So side B contains these final 3 tracks that still adhere to its repetitive and minimalistic drumming style, but instead of using it as a way to create more soothing and hypnotic tracks, its repetitive framework is now used to create just a more loose and a more raw and just energetic feel, much like you'd hear in punk music. Take the track Hero for example, where Klaus Dinger is just singing in an excessively slurred voice. It just really reminds me of vocalists like John Lydon from the Sex Pistols. There's something so incredibly free-flowing listening to this album despite each side having different styles. And I think that really clearly showcases and just reminds us how this common musical idea of repetition can be utilized so effectively in different sonic contexts. And again, I think krautrock bands were one of the first bands to really embrace this kind of thing, and I think because of that, they have played some significant roles in influencing a lot of styles, especially hip-hop and electronic music. Thank you, Kraftwerk.
Sorry, I just want to make a really quick, crappy edit here. I think that repetition is good. It's not always good, but why I think it works for this particular album is because intention is really important in art, and I think noise music, at least here, comes off very, very clear that it is free and improvisational. As to the clear reasons as to why, I'm not exactly sure, but not to be cliche, I just kind of feel it in the music. You know, I also partly think it's just because the drumming on this album is so tight and so crisp. I love the snare on this thing, and the drum fills just work perfectly to communicate this message that what they're doing just feels very free, lack for a better term.
Still, I don't think this album Noise 75 is for everyone. However, it's still definitely a lot more accessible than my last review of Suicide. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not an album that is supposed to pull you in with memorable melodic hooks or rhythms. More so instead, at least to me, is more like a soundtrack to whatever you find has a sense of movement and progression, whether that's driving down a long road or just getting some work done. I love putting this thing on.